Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to the virtual presentation of the 2021 William J. O'Neill Lecture in Business Journalism. It's entitled The 19th, Informing Women and Transforming News. My name is Jake Batzel, and I'm the O'Neill Chair in Business Journalism and also an Associate Professor here at SMU. Each spring, this lecture series brings outstanding business journalism professionals to the SMU community. And the series is part of the O'Neill Program in Business Journalism, which is an interdisciplinary program in financial reporting developed in 2007 by the Meadow School Division of Journalism and the Cox School of Business at SMU. This is all through funding from William J. O'Neill, an SMU alumnus and also chairman and CEO of Investors Business Daily, and we continue to be grateful to the O'Neill family for their support. I actually oversee the O'Neill Program in Business Journalism, which you can learn more about by visiting the short link you see up in the blue sky above Dallas Hall there, j.mp/O'NeillSMU. And if you have questions about enrolling in the O'Neill program, especially if you're a current or prospective SMU student, please feel free to contact me anytime. My email address is listed there on the slide as well. But let's get back to why you're here, the lecture. And the lecture portion of this presentation is going to last around an hour with about 10 or 15 minutes built in for questions. And as you listen to the presentation, please feel free to type in questions for tonight's speakers into the Q&A feature below. The chat feature is going to be used for updates and announcements by our team throughout the program. One fun little twist is we are going to have a special sock giveaway. So as we've done with other virtual events in the past, before we say goodbye, one lucky lecture participant will win a limited edition pair of SMU Meadow School of the Arts socks. So you must be present to claim your prize. So please stick around if you want to be in the running for the sock sweepstakes. At any rate, let's move to the program. It's now my distinct privilege to introduce our speakers, Emily Ramshaw and Amanda Zamora. After breaking ground in nonprofit journalism as top leaders at the Texas Tribune, Emily and Amanda spent 2020 launching their own national news organization, the 19th. And they launched it with the hypothesis, as they put it in a letter to their supporters a few weeks ago. They launched it with the hypothesis that women, and in particular women of color, were hungry for a serious politics and policy news platform that elevated their voices and centered their experiences. I'll let them tell you everything they've been up to over the past year, but I will tell you that the 19th is one of the most exciting new entrepreneurial experiments in the entire American media landscape. It's drawn $12 million in philanthropic funding and nearly 10,000 members, while also creating an inclusive and empowering newsroom culture and constantly publishing courageous and groundbreaking journalism that explains and humanizes the pandemic's disproportionate economic impacts on the communities that the 19th is serving. So to quickly read their individual bios to give you a little bit better idea of their background. Emily Ramshaw is the co-founder and CEO of the 19th. She previously was editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, an award-winning nonpartisan digital news startup that now boasts the largest state house reporting bureau in the country and the nation's most successful business model for local news. A Washington, D.C. native, Ramshaw started her career at the Dallas Morning News, which I know because I used to work with her there. She's the youngest member of the board of the Pulitzer Prize and a graduate of Northwestern University. Ramshaw lives with her husband and daughter in Austin. She's joined by Amanda Zamora, the co-founder and publisher of the 19th. Previously, Zamora spent nearly 2 decades as a digital editor, product manager, and audience strategist at newsrooms, including the Texas Tribune, ProPublica, and the Washington Post. A Houston native, Zamora has a bachelor's in journalism from the University of Texas at Austin and also lives in Austin. So thank you so much for joining us, Emily and Amanda, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having us. As Jake said, I'm Amanda, this is Emily, and we have a conversation sort of lined up for you, but we're gonna start. We hope that most of you are pretty familiar with the 19th, if not subscribed to our newsletter and following us on social. But in case you haven't been following our every move, we've got a little bit of a look at what we've been up to over the last 6 to 12 months, what we've put together, a whirlwind tour of the 19th. Emily, anything else before we show and tell?
No, excited to show this to you and thrilled to get to be in conversation with Amanda virtually, which we get to do all day long and now together with you. So hit it.
Right. see. I kind of get goosebumps every time I watch that. I know it was long. Thank you all for bearing with us, but
It's great. The music also makes me get a little bit sweaty too.
All right, well, that's literally the whirlwind tour of the things that we got online last year. But can you please, and actually before we get into Q&A, let me also just emphasize to everyone watching, to all 182 people on this presentation, first of all, we're so grateful that you're here, and we hope that you are all warm and snuggly and safe and recovering from last week. Emily and I like to do these as sort of rolling conversations. We prefer that much over talking at you or doing slide decks for an hour. So this is going to be a conversation and we want you to be a part of it. So please make sure that you post your questions for us as they come to you in the Q&A. And as Jake mentioned at the top of this, we're going to save some time to make sure that we get through some of those. So hit us up with your questions. And I'm going to start with Emily to walk us way back to before the 19th was even really the 19th, before we had christened the 19th with the name and the asterisk. Where did the 19th come from? Where in your brain? How did it begin? What was the idea? When, at what point? Like, just tell us how all of this got started.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so we'll take you like in the serious way back machine. I mean, I think the first time this concept occurred to me, so Amanda and I had worked for several years together at the Texas Tribune, and I'd say about 4 or 5 years ago now, I was on maternity leave with a baby girl when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump in that presidential election. And in the moment, like, I'd been reading so many headlines around electability and likability, all these headlines that seemed like fundamentally sexist to me. And I sort of thought, like, had this fleeting idea, like, we need a new national newsroom of record for women. And then it went sort of in one ear and out the other. I went back to like trying to keep a human being alive, which was a big priority then. And then 4 years later, you know, we had more women than ever before on the 2020 stage, more women of color than ever on the 2020 stage. And in that moment, you know, we still saw those headlines around electability and likability, but we also saw, you know, Stacey Abrams, is she too ambitious? Kamala Harris, like, does she want it too much? You know, conversations around the vice presidency or the presidency that seemed not just sexist, but also seemed, you know, candidly, fundamentally racist. And around that moment, I asked Amanda to come meet me for coffee. And I was like, I can't get this idea out of my head. Like, what if we started this new national newsroom aimed at elevating the voices of women in particular? And we can talk about how that has evolved over time later. But Amanda, I want to sort of turn it around. And Amanda's premise, Amanda basically was like, first of all, Amanda's the best in the business. For any of you, if you were trying to build an audience, Amanda is the person you want with you. And Amanda's response to me basically was, you know, I'll do this if we're centering women of color, underserved communities. And talk to me a little bit about that, Amanda, and sort of where your head was on that, and how the sort of asterisk came into play for us and our logo and our name and identity.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my very first reaction was, are you crazy? Because it literally was just a lightning bolt out of nowhere. This was not the what I was expecting to discuss. It was over beers, happy hour. So
I was cleaning it up for this crowd.
I mean, I was certainly game to do it, and I knew that we were both capable, but I didn't want to replicate more of the same in terms of, I think that there are already a lot of options for sort of a white mainstream audience, and that what was missing really was an emphasis on diversity from the get-go, and really trying to think outside of, you know, DC and New York and LA and sort of the mainstream media markets, and think, take advantage. You know, I grew up in Texas, but Emily and I flip-flopped. So Emily's from the East Coast and moved to Texas, and I went to the University of Texas J School, and I got out of Texas as soon as I could. I wanted to get out of Texas. I spent the better part of a decade in DC and then New York. And Emily recruited me back home to Texas in 2016, and I have to tell you, it was a fascinating transition and culture clash, like time warp for me, to be observing the 2016 election through a very starkly different Facebook feed. If anybody has moved, you know that one of the first things that Facebook adjusts its algorithm for you is based on your location. And it was very evident to me just how I had traded one bubble for another when I moved from Texas to DC and New York. And so the opportunity really that I felt was before us is to step outside of all of that and think about how we could tackle a women's media platform that didn't treat women as a monolithic, common denominator, being, only focusing on white women, frankly, or affluent women, but like who was really thinking about where the stories start and who is impacted by the stories, and really trying to represent women as we are in the country. We are racially and ethnically diverse. We live in all sorts of different communities, urban, suburban, off the coast. So I think that was really what the original sort of opportunity felt like for me, was to really do it differently. And I always joke that, like, I don't know why I'm still in political journalism, because so much frustrates me about political journalism. Well, this was like the moment to kind of reinvent and start from scratch. So that's what I saw.
I do want to talk a little bit about, so we knew we liked the name the 19th, right? Like, in honor of the 19th Amendment, which had its centennial in our launch year in 2020. Talk to me a little bit about the asterisk. You're like such an incredible brand person. Tell me like where that came from.
Sure. Well, the 19th itself, it happened to be, the centennial of the 19th Amendment that was supposed to grant women access to the ballot box. And what, one of the biggest questions that we had was, could we really have this news organization branded the 19th and have this mission that emphasized diversity, and also understand that the 19th Amendment did not immediately grant all women equal access to the ballot box, that women of color, Black women in particular, who had been championing suffrage were sidelined, and fought for generations more for voting rights. And that's an ongoing fight to this day for many people. And so the asterisk, and I have to give a shout out to Carla Delgado. So the asterisk was like the way that we could modernize, frankly, the 19th and make it clear that this is not a brand that speaks to the past. It's a brand that speaks to the future and where we want to be. We want news to be more representative because we think that democracy needs to be better representative. And the asterisk technically denotes errors or omissions, right? And that in and of itself denotes these are the people who were left out of the franchise, who we should be paying more attention to, who we should be centering, whose voices we should be centering. So just that idea of it denoting that we are very conscious of the fact that the 19th is an ongoing work in progress for American democracy. And also, frankly, this idea that that asterisk is intersectional. If you look at it, it is sort of an ode to the red and the blue of our political system, sort of our 19th take on those colors. But purple is our core color because that is where the intersection lies. That is where, frankly, our strength lies in being able to kind of do the Venn diagram of all of these intersectional experiences to see what we have in common and what we can take from those common experiences. So acknowledging our differences, also acknowledging our commonalities and looking at that nuance in political journalism.
I think that I love that, and I love the visual. And I think the other really nice thing about the asterisk is that it allows us to recognize that the 19th, our brand, our platform gets to be a work in progress too, and an evolution. I mean, we'll talk about some of the specifics on this later, but I think one big thing that we learned pretty early on was that, there was a huge audience for our work among the LGBTQ community, people who were also reflected by that asterisk and who were not having the same opportunities to have their voices elevated and reflected. And so, we made an intentional move just last month to more directly say, our audience, we're aiming to serve not just women, people of color, but also the LGBTQ community in our journalism and through our audience and events reach. So it's just been a nice emblem for us that works across so many levels. So
yeah, I want to put a pin in that and come back to some of the takeaways from year one. But let's go actually back to January 27th, if you can imagine, just barely a little more than a year ago. We were launching the 19th and explaining what it meant and the asterisk, like putting the mission out there so that we could start to fundraise to make this vision that you had a reality. And then a pandemic hit. You and I had done all of this homework. We had our 3-year plan and our business model and our pitch deck, and then a pandemic struck. And I would love to hear you explain what that was like as a CEO, and this dream that you have suddenly put at risk by this literally unforeseeable act of God event. What was that like?
First of all, I'll say it was our dream and our plan, not mine. But I mean, it was terrifying. Sometimes it's still terrifying. I think, look, I'm a brand new baby CEO, just to be perfectly blunt. Like, I had been running a newsroom. I had not been a fundraiser. I was only sort of comfortable with budgets. We had this big game plan of the things we were going to do and the money we needed to spend and what we needed to raise and who we needed to hire. Things really sort of came to a grinding halt for us. I think, we in late February, maybe the first week of March, like, we went on this planning trip to Philadelphia where we were going to have a big launch summit. We came back from Philadelphia and suddenly, like, everything stopped. Our fundraising had been up around $700,000 a month. And for the months of March, April, and I think May, it was down at $37,000 a month. I mean, that, an enormous difference, obviously. We really sort of recalibrated, tried to look at our numbers to see, like, all right, who did we have to hire now? Should we consider, and there was a hot second where Amanda and I were like, maybe we should wait a year, like, just sit tight and try to do this after the pandemic, which we assumed would be like, whatever, 6 months or something. Ha. Thank God we didn't wait. But then we recognized we got an infusion of generous money from a couple of our major donors to help us launch on time, because we recognized really that this moment in history, women, people of color, the LGBTQ community, they were going to be hardest hit by this pandemic, and that we had in many ways an obligation to stay the course. So yeah, Amanda, I mean, I'll let you take over from the product side about, like, what this was. Yes, it was scary from a fundraising capacity. Our corporate revenue, which is a big part of our business model, dried up almost overnight. So from a financial standpoint, it was terrifying. And every expletive you want to put next to that, terrifying. Talk about building this thing, like, remotely, I mean, building a team, building a website, all basically over Zoom.
Yeah, so we're 26 now full-time hires, by the way. So that's how big our staff is. And the majority of our staff is still, or maybe I would say half of our staff has still never met in person, just to put that in perspective. So January 27th was sort of our beta launch. And from there, I was sort of on the clock. We knew that we wanted to get our platforms, our daily news platforms, online that first week of August. So pretty tight turn. If you consider that we have 0 people, it was like me and Emily in a hotel room with a Squarespace page and like a donations plugin. We had nothing. We literally were starting from 0. So this was a total build the plane while you're flying it, and the pandemic just threw an extra wrinkle into it. Thankfully, we had already found our people in Upstatement, the great design team that helped us conceive of sort of the website and the newsletters as we launched them into the world in August. But we hadn't hired, I don't think that we had hired anyone besides Andrea and Aaron. Andrea is our editor-in-chief, and Aaron Haynes, as you all know, is our editor-at-large. You see her all the time on MSNBC and on social. And so thank God that extra booster shot of capital from some of our founding donors allowed us to continue to hire. And so basically my job was to hire up the design and engineering team and audience team while we were also working with Upstatement to build. Like, we couldn't wait to have everyone in place. So it was a lesson in flexibility and adaptability. And then I think the second thing that sort of stands out to me in terms of getting all of these resources online and project managing this epic launch, which also included, by the way, the summit, which we'll talk about in a little bit when we talk a little bit more about events, was just that we were, as Emily said, doing it all remotely. And I think one of the silver linings, there are so many silver linings, to be honest, we have so much to be grateful for, was that we had to figure out from day one how to build a culture that would translate over Zoom and Slack. And I think we wouldn't have done as good a job if the majority of us were in the office together in Austin, and then in addition, figuring out what to do with everyone who was on Slack. Slack was the great equalizer. The pandemic was the great equalizer. And so we ended up with things like we still have it. I don't know how long we'll keep it. Every morning you can log into our Slack and our core team channel. Everyone's piping in with what they're working on for the day. What they need from teammates, what their schedule will be like, what their life is like. We've got Zoom happy hours. I don't know. So we just adapted, and I think have tried to hold a lot of grace and space for each other to kind of also just be humans who are having a tough time. And when you need to sort of be off of Zoom for a hot minute to kind of regroup or recover from a tough day, I mean, we've really tried to roll with it. I don't know if I'm leaving anything out. Emily?
I mean, I think the only thing I'd add to how hard this was, I mean, we had people on our team who lost family members from COVID. We've had a lot of moms on our team who have had no childcare for the duration of this pandemic. And one thing that Amanda and I laid out from day one was that we wanted to be different from other newsrooms in the benefits that we provided. Like, we committed, before the pandemic was a glimmer of, of an idea, we committed to 6 months of fully paid family leave for new parents. We committed to 4 months of fully paid caregiver leave for people who needed to care for elderly or sick relatives. We agreed to cover 100% of healthcare premiums. All of these things that were like sort of critically important to us from the standpoint of helping our journalists, our employees rise through the ranks over the course of their lives and their careers and balance all of those things. Grappling with those things in a pandemic, we provided some childcare stipends for moms in our newsroom to enable them literally to get us to launch. The circumstances under which our team operated, not to mention going through this summer of racial reckoning, where we're a newsroom where we encourage our journalists to bring their full lived experiences to work. These have been unbelievably difficult circumstances. And then take last week as an example. Those of us in Texas, which is about half of our organization, were totally brought to our knees. The amazing benefit of having a totally distributed newsroom is that our reporters all over the country outside of Texas totally held it down. You wouldn't have known from looking at our website that half of our staff, didn't have power or water. That's been the other sort of interesting silver lining in all of this, is that this distributed workforce has really allowed us to excel and to give a break to the people on our team who need one. So culturally, it's just really a beautiful thing.
Let's back up a step. We're focused on business journalism. So let's talk about the model. Like, why did we choose to do the 19th as a nonprofit? Can you explain what the business model is all about and how we came to that decision, and how you talked a little bit about benefits being another point of distinction, but how do you layer the mission itself and the asterisk, not just on the journalism, but on the way that we operate? What does that look like?
So let me tackle the nonprofit question first. So we decided to be a nonprofit for 3 primary reasons. The first was we believe deeply that all of our journalism should be entirely free to consume. Regardless of your situation in life, you shouldn't have to pay for our journalism. The second is we wanted our journalism to be entirely free to republish by every other news organization in America. So right now, 260 plus regional newspapers have access to and publish our work. Univision translates our work into Spanish and distributes it. On any given day, you can find our stories everywhere from Mississippi Today to Ms. Magazine to Harper's Bazaar. I mean, it's all over the place. And so we knew the challenges facing newsrooms around the country and wanted to provide them with this boost of journalism around the intersection of gender, politics, and policy, also for free. And the third reason was because we really wanted to provide world-class benefits, competitive salaries, and all of those things combined to us meant that this was a safer venture as a nonprofit. I also drink the nonprofit media Kool-Aid. I mean, Amanda and I had come from the Texas Tribune, which has done this exceptionally well, and we knew the business model there worked. And so that business model, our business model, is largely 5 primary buckets of revenue. So individual philanthropy, foundation philanthropy, corporate underwriting, which is sort of, generally the corporate social responsibility or diversity, equity, inclusion budgets of major companies. Membership, which I'll let Amanda talk about in a second because it's been like such a runaway success for us, but that's not pay to play. That's, viewers like you, public radio, public television style, be part of our community. And then live events. And that is generally either corporate or foundation support of those live events. For us, to date, we have raised almost $12 million. I mean, in basically the last 18 months, we've raised nearly $12 million across those different buckets, which is pretty extraordinary, especially in the time that we're operating in. We have a lot of confidence that this business model is one that'll allow us to be both sustained and safe. There's safety in diversity from the standpoint of your finances. Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit about membership?
Sure. As Emily said, membership is sort of the other piece of our revenue portfolio, and it's also a big part of our audience strategy. We think it's the ultimate expression of engagement if someone, and also as Emily said, it's not pay to play. So we're not expecting you to donate or become a member in order to receive access to our journalism or frankly, in order to engage with us. We think that membership is, it may not be the biggest piece of our revenue portfolio, as I like to say, but it's like the heartbeat of our revenue portfolio because it's what tells us that not only do our audience members believe in our mission, that they are validating the mission and saying, yes, I think that this is important too, but they're saying, you are doing a good job at meeting the mission, at executing that mission, and I endorse what you're doing. And I'm going to support more of it by, making a donation. Usually in increments of $19 has been a very popular price point. But what's funny is that, well, not funny, but just mind blowing to us, what we originally modeled out, we would have been happy if we started this year with 1,000 members, and we ended up with nearly 10,000 at the end of our first year. It has accounted for online donations have accounted for upwards of 800,000 of the revenue from our first year. So it was another silver lining and a lifeline when we saw the pandemic really kind of, pull the rug out from under digital display advertising and sponsorship dollars. Membership was a real lifeline for us. And so, I think it speaks to, again, don't underestimate your readership or this idea that people won't pay for news. They absolutely will. And if they, believe in what you're doing, and if you are willing to go the extra mile and make your audience strategy not just about pushing news and content at people, but including people in the conversation and building authentic relationships with people. And that's what we see our membership community as being about, is thinking of them as stakeholders, having a seat at the table in the way that we're updating them, every month about what we're doing. And so membership has been a real bright light from the first year, and I wouldn't trade our members for the world.
I want to ask you just around that. I mean, I think one thing that has contributed to the 19th having a really strong member base is that, unlike a lot of newsrooms, we from day one laid out values. We said, the 19th stands for things. Not all newsrooms tell you they stand for things, but we stand for gender equity, and we stand for racial justice, and we stand for human rights. I want to hear you talk a little bit about how those values have played out across our organization and in our journalism, and specific, sort of how we think about diversity, equity, inclusion from the ground floor. Like, we have the luxury of doing that, honestly, from day one, in the ways that a lot of newsrooms right now are trying to play catch up.
Yeah, well, first of all, that we prioritize diversity from the get-go. And as not as a thing that we cover or assign stories around, but that we internalize and live in how we build the organization and how we remain open to people. If you're creating a diverse team, that means that you're also opening yourself up to the lived experiences of a diverse group of people. And so being open to feedback and thinking about story assignments and framing differently. I think when, at the beginning, as we were kind of putting our team together, I joked like I feel like we have a refugee kind of sense about us, because we are accustomed to coming from organizations where our ideas might get shut down, or we might be, we might be accustomed to compartmentalizing because there's just this idea in news that you kind of have to check your lived experience at the door when you get into reporting mode. And I think that what we're doing differently is saying, we want to acknowledge the lived experiences of our staff and embrace how that informs and improves the journalism and the brainstorming that we do around stories. And even in defining, what a story is for the 19th, just again, bringing it back to the asterisk. I think Andrea Valdez is our editor-in-chief, and she's done a tremendous job of helping to even define what that means for us. What is a story that we're going to go for versus what we're not going to go for. I think the Breonna Taylor story is a great example of that, of a story that, we were able to kind of bring to a national consciousness before it really was a story that before the hashtag and before people were really paying attention, recognizing that this isn't just about a local police killing, but this is about looking at police killings and how they also are impacting Black women, and why aren't we talking about that? And so, yeah, I think it has made a huge difference in how we approach the journalism, and bringing it back to membership. I think the through line there is that people are seeing that the difference in, the headlines on our site and the stories that we are tweeting and sharing, and they're saying, I feel seen and thank you. And that is, by and large, that is what we hear from people when they're signing up for our newsletters and becoming members, when they're saying why it is, why they're inspired to be reading and following and subscribing and donating.
Love it.
Do you want to, can we talk a little bit more about the journalism? It's been an epic year. We've talked a little bit about the pandemic already, but I would love to hear what you think about in terms of, one of the goals that we set out in the beginning was we wanted the 19th to be a household name. We wanted to be a credible, political news organization that, we were competing with the Washington Post and the New York Times, like that people knew what the 19th was, what we were about, and they were going to take our reporting seriously. And I can think of a number of stories that have put us on the map. But Emily, what are some of the standout stories for you from this first year?
Sure. I think, you touched on the Breonna Taylor piece, which was really critically important, obviously, and that was before we even had a website to speak of. I think, one of our day one stories was really a sort of hallmark story on the She session and how this pandemic has really set women back in the workforce. In some ways, maybe by a generation. It was a hugely well-read story. It ran on the front page of USA Today, literally our first day publishing, made a lot of waves. I think, to date, maybe the best read story or close to it on our website is a story about Kamala Harris's complicated relationship with the LGBTQ community that really in many ways sort of went viral. And then I think, look, we were in the headlines in a pretty big way just last week or the week before around our colleague Amanda Becker's coverage of the Lincoln Project, which has been pretty groundbreaking and pretty transformative. So, as far as being part of the national conversation, I think, we have punched above our weight in a pretty extraordinary way. Again, given that we've only truly been publishing on our own platform for 6 or 7 months now. We had the first sit-down interview with Kamala Harris, not just as the VP nominee, but then when she was VP, to have a brand new baby news organization score that kind of access, those kinds of interviews, this early on is pretty extraordinary. So yeah, I think those have been the standouts for me. Are there any other editorial stories for you that you wanted to comment on?
The only other one that I have a special place in my heart for too is, first of all of the above, all of those stories and just the entire team has been incredible. I feel like, again, all of this coming online virtually overnight. I also really liked our coverage. I, as a Latina, as a Mexican-American woman who again, with my Texas to DC to Texas flip-flop, like, and being so frustrated with how the national media covered Texans and Latinos, like, I have appreciated our coverage of that electorate. You know, before the election came, we were talking about the nuances of Latino voters and how, you know, depending, you know, Latinos in Florida may not be voting the same way that they're voting in Arizona. And that's what we saw play out in the election results, and that we were there beforehand, not being reactionary, but being proactive about really exploring the women's electorate in a more complex and nuanced way. And so, yeah, I feel like we are just getting started. I'm just so proud of the entire team, and I can't wait to see what the next year brings, you know, just with more as they get into a groove. I think we're just getting started.
Yeah. I want to also ask, you know, we had to make a pretty big pivot early on around events, which we knew would be a cornerstone for us. You had basically rolled out this incredible plan for a national listening tour where we're going to go city to city. And then what happened?
And then a pandemic hit, and it became really scary. The idea of being in person with strangers and shaking their hands, and just like an icky, scary concept. And so we quickly pivoted. The reason that we did, so we could have said, we'll just wait for events and we'll do it next year. We could have put it off. We should have probably reasonably, like any sane person, we're like, we'll get to that later. But no, events were a great lifeline for us too in generating corporate revenue. We still, you know, had a healthy, you know, revenue stream around opportunity that we translated into, you know, revenue around events. And so we got busy figuring out how to assemble virtual audiences for our events. I think, frankly, we're hiring right now for this events director role. And digital is going to be such an important part of our portfolio, frankly, maybe the majority. And in fact, I don't know how I thought we were going to scale the literally moving from place to place and have the same kind of volume and frequency that we were able to achieve with events. So we've learned so much. We've reached so many more people through events and had really important conversations that we would not have had otherwise. And can we please talk about the summit, Emily Ramshaw, and some of the big hit names? Okay, so talking about the news first, again, landing Kamala Harris and having the first interview with her as a vice presidential candidate. But we've had a range of speakers, diverse speakers on both sides of the political aisle, and we've had some. Why do we have celebrities at our events? Like, how is that even a thing?
Yeah. Who knows? I mean, I think that what was fascinating is when we pivoted for our launch summit from in person, where we hoped maybe we'd have 500 people in the room, to virtual, suddenly you could ask anyone. And at the end of the day, we had this idea that maybe we could have some artistic elements mixed in with this really meaty policy programming, and maybe that would draw, viewers into our mix who would then learn about the 19th and who might not have learned about the 19th otherwise. So I will always say that it all started with Meryl Streep, because we got played like 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Meryl Streep agreed to be to read these incredible suffrage speeches for our launch summit. And when she said yes, suddenly everybody else said yes. And suddenly we had Hillary Clinton, and we had Melinda Gates, and we had Kamala Harris, and we had, all these performers suddenly in the mix. Like, the Go-Go's got back together, the first all-woman band to top the Billboard charts. We had just incredible one after the other. And this is extended into the next round of our events, where we have had Natalie Portman, where we've had Brandi Carlile. The performances have been extraordinary. The speaking has been phenomenal. And suddenly our launch summit, where we had thought originally we might have 500 people in the room, we had 180,000 people tuned in to watch. And from the standpoint of brand development and our reach, that's just extraordinary. But yeah, I had no celebrity relationships whatsoever. People have just been extraordinarily interested in being engaged. And of course, this Meghan Markle interview, which will go down in history, she and her team reached out to us and basically said, we hear you're a newsroom that stands for gender equity and racial justice. These are things that we care about. And, I'd love to be part of this in conversation in a way where I can promote the 19th. So I'd say some of those 180,000 people who tuned in were there for Meghan Markle. The rest of them were there for us. But it's just been wild. Yeah.
We kept plenty of people with us, though. We had so many people donating and signing up for the newsletters. So I think we definitely made the most of that moment. She did make big waves.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a little bit of a secret sauce there. And also, again, just in the reinventing politics and policy, like, I think it's actually really important to think about ways that we can make these conversations more accessible and more multidimensional. They don't always have to be talking the same kind of talking heads that you see on cable TV that people just want to tune out to after a certain point. So we have a couple more questions here, and then we're going to open the floor up to you all because we want to hear from you. So fair warning, if you really have a burning question, please get it into the Q&A so that we can see it. Before we do that though, Emily, I want to kind of recap the year. We just marked the first year of the 19th, and we did make a couple changes. Jake was mentioning earlier the memo that we sent to members, just explaining what we felt like we had learned from the first year. Can you talk a little bit about what those changes or what those big lessons were from the first year?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first is, we have made an explicit decision. We had labeled ourselves a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom. And we feel like over the last couple of years, the term nonpartisan has sort of become co-opted to sort of mean, both sidesism or equal time to equal sides. And we are living through a moment in history, where just candidly, like, there hasn't been the same adherence to facts and evidence as there has in many years past. And we started to sort of grapple with that word nonpartisan and decided we wanted to change our branding to be an independent nonprofit newsroom. And what that means for us basically is we feel like extended permission to call truths truths and lies lies, to be, if one side of the equation is not peddling factual or accurate information, we don't feel like we have to peddle that side of the equation. And so for us, we feel like that gives us a little bit more of the sort of flexibility and independence to say, yes, we are going to aim for an ideologically diverse audience to cover all sides of the political spectrum. We're going to do it with facts and evidence and science on our side. That's part one. Part two is, as we said a little earlier in this conversation, one thing we learned really early on in our journalism is that women are not the only people who are disproportionately affected by the power of the patriarchy. And we made really early inroads with the LGBTQ community in our reporting, and some of those stories were the most read stories on our website. And we determined that we thought we needed to expand our audience and aim not just to serve women, not just to serve people of color, but also to really, openly and directly serve and highlight stories affecting the LGBTQ community. So we're excited about those lines of coverage. We're excited to broaden our mission in that regard. And we're honestly excited to be a newsroom where we feel like we can continue to evolve and grow, to better serve our audience. So those are some of the changes we've made. Amanda, before we hop into the audience questions, I hope you could do the fun part about sort of like talking about what's next, because we have some pretty big growth plans this year.
Yeah, well, literally front of mind is we're hiring our first events director, because all of the things that you just heard described, we did without like a dedicated person on staff leading events, which is another mind-boggling thing. We are hiring for partnerships. We are excited to really be building on the republishing partnerships that we have with USA Today and other news organizations to really be proactive about thinking what a partnership looks like in community, how that could also be a two-way street, and how we can collaborate on reporting and conversations and events and community building with different publishers around the country. Podcasting, we're very excited to dip our toes into the podcasting waters. I'm a total podcast freak. I don't know if any of you all are and have some podcast tips or things that we should be listening to, but we're really in hardcore R&D mode to get ready to launch the 19th first ever podcast. Those are just a few of the highlights for this year.
And we're nearly doubling the size of our newsroom. So specific investments around, we're going to hire a reporter to cover caregiving for us, everywhere from childcare to elder care, disparities in public education, gender and climate. So lots of exciting reporting positions you can spread the word about soon. So, and now we've got Jake joining us to hit us with the burning questions from the audience.
Yes, sounds good. A little more illuminated by some lights here as the sun has gone down. But thank you all so much for the overview of what the 19th and everything that it's accomplished. We've got a lot of awesome questions here and some limited time to address them, but I'm going to take priority as a journalism professor to prioritize some student questions first. So the first one comes from Ciara Johnson. She says, hi there. Would you say that there's an underrepresentation of marginalized communities of women as journalists or as subjects of stories, or both? And how do we combat this?
Absolutely both. I don't have the data at the tip of my tongue, but absolutely both. I mean, that was the premise for our pitch for, funders to back the 19th, was just that the overwhelming majority of people assigning stories and shaping the front pages and narratives of mainstream newsrooms in terms of political coverage are white men. And so absolutely the answer is yes. And the same goes for sourcing on stories. That's actually something that we're interested in figuring out how we can capture as a data point and be reporting out on, in addition to the diversity stats for our staff. So the answer is absolutely yes. And the way that we can combat it is just by deciding to and prioritizing, diverse hiring. And an example from our early days, even in the photo assignments, like just flexing muscles where we're just paying way more attention to the details. And when we were trying to gather photos for our newsletter, relying on, AP wires or Getty wires, a reader pointed out to us, like, did y'all notice that you've run several, photos in your newsletter from men? And like, you might want to consider all of these amazing women of color out here. And we're like, oh, duh, yeah. So the first lesson there is being open to feedback, not just from inside your newsroom, but from beyond, and then doing something about it. And so Andrea prioritized, and we have ever since, really trying to cultivate relationships with journalists of color, beyond whether it's, looking for, wire photos or working with freelance illustrators or photographers. So.
Great. Okay. Well, let's switch gears a little bit, but still another journalism student. This is from Audrey McClure. She says, why Texas, and how has being in Texas influenced the 19th as a business and as a publication?
Why Texas?
I wonder after weeks like last week.
I know. I mean, the short answer is I don't want to live somewhere else. And I lured Amanda back home to Texas, and now I want her to stick around here too. But I think, the longer answer to that is I also want to prove the case that you can build a national media brand from the center of the country, that not everything has to be done in New York and DC. And candidly, I think that's been a pretty incredible selling point for us as we've gone around the country trying to make the case for the 19th. So yeah, Texas is special. Again, last week was very special, but it's been for us, I think, a really heartening place to be. Oh, I also would add that our experience at the Texas Tribune probably gave us more of a front row seat than many of our journalism peers to true ideological diversity in an audience. We are in Austin. I spent the last several years covering, living in one of the most progressive cities in the country, covering one of the most conservative state legislatures in the country. And I think, Amanda in particular, I think, has a family background where there are divergent political views. And I think our experiences in this state, and for her, probably in her family, has meant that I think it gives us the ability to think more broadly about what a truly ideologically diverse audience can look like.
I should also point out that our reporting staff is very geographically dispersed from, Philadelphia, New Orleans,
Orlando. Yeah,
we're all that's by design, and we're excited to continue to grow the reporting ranks and just have journalists sprinkled all over the country. We'll take, if someone is really a kick butt journalist and wants to be reporting for us from New York City, great. If you want to be reporting for us from Des Moines, great. So.
Terrific. Well, let's make it a trifecta of student questions. And this one comes from Logan Ledger. And she's asking, aside from struggles due to the pandemic, what struggles did you face from being a woman-founded organization in a very male-dominated industry?
Emily was on the front lines of this.
I could talk about it a little bit from the standpoint of fundraising, which is its own can of worms, but I think it's intimidating a lot. Look, the people who have the most wealth in this country are white men. And so when you are going after potential funders to make the case for what you are trying to build, you are trying to make the case. Look, I'm very public about this. I sat in meetings with potential funders who said things like, so when are you going to hire your first man? Like literally, that's a question they would ask. Or, could you uncross your arms because it makes me think you're angry with me, and I don't want to fund an organization where it's just a bunch of women being angry with men. Like these are literal conversations. Like I would go sit in my car afterward and like burst into tears because I was like, I'm never going to be able to make this happen. So you're really still up against that. Women raise a tiny percentage. Women-owned, women-led enterprises still raise a tiny percentage of the startup capital that startups run by men do, and in particular, white men do. And so, of course, you're up against that. We fought hard through that, and the great news is there are a lot of really generous women out there. I'd say the overwhelming majority of our philanthropic gifts come from women, but it's been an uphill battle for sure. Amanda, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Well, I would just flip that and say, we also had people in the early days who warned us against like other women who were like, are you really going to hire a newsroom with so many women? Like, isn't that going to be like drama and this and that? I mean, women are just as capable of perpetuating, stereotypes about other women. And I would just say a couple of things. First of all, is that we're not all women. We do have a trans reporter. We have a man on staff. We are open to diversity in gender as well as, race and all of these other areas. So that's first of all. And the second thing is that I also think, and I'll just speak for myself, like one of the things that can be, in my experience, like women are good at talking themselves out of things, of not just going, taking big risks and, letting imposter syndrome kind of hold us back. And so my response to that question would be like, in my experience this entire year, every single person on our staff, regardless of their gender, has been the opposite of that, has been so empowering of each other and supportive of each other, and everyone has been there cheerleading each other on, whether it's about a story or about coping in the pandemic and just showing up for one another. So I guess, I don't think it has been a drawback, our focus on gender at all. It's been a great strength.
Okay, terrific.
And I'll uncross my arms for the next question.
Yes, thank you. Limbs akimbo, right?
Exactly.
So, this is transitioning to a question from Dr. Melita Garza at TCU, and she says she's a member of the 19th and very much attracted to the inclusive ethic of your organization. I'm curious, what are some specific ways you've reached out to Latinas, Asian American women, Native Americans, who, as you know, are mostly invisible in national political journalism?
I mean, I think that comes down to the reporting. I feel like the reporters are sort of on the ground and trying to resource stories, whether it's about healthcare or the electorate, or I'm trying to think. I mean, to me, it feels like the journalism is the best expression of that kind of outreach, and that what will follow from there as we sort of invest more resources in our community engagement strategy, more will follow in terms of events, in terms of crowd call outs where we're asking for people's stories, and taking the time to go out and not expect people to come to the website, but going and finding where people are in community online or offline, frankly, and not expecting also that everyone is going to be on the internet waiting for us to be asking for their stories, like that we're going to need to meet people where they are. And sometimes that means, again, working through local papers, working through SMS, working through WhatsApp. A lot of those kinds of outreach efforts, they just take more time and intention and being proactive. And those aren't typically the kinds of resources that newsrooms have at their disposal to invest in audience development. Most news organizations, they're facing declining resources and are just trying to get the headlines out. And so those are some of the things beyond the reporting itself that we are hell-bent on prioritizing and investing in terms of outreach.
Excellent, thanks. Well, I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Also do want to mention, we do have a winner of the giveaway, the sock giveaway, but I'm going to wait till the end to announce that winner. Going back to a question from an SMU student, Drishti Sachdeva asks, how does the 19th cater to younger voices, and have you experienced problems with generation gaps in your careers?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, honestly, we across our reporting, we are aiming to target, different generational. I don't think we've experienced a generational divide. We have one day we'll have a story about how young women, and in particular women so young they can't even vote yet, are the ones who are becoming poll workers, to replace the older women who feel like they can't be poll workers because of the risk of the coronavirus. That was like an incredibly well received and well read story, well shared story. We also have a reporter who's been really deeply covering older women and the challenges they face, in particular over the course of this pandemic. The economic woes they're facing with retirement, as a result of career setbacks over the course of this pandemic. So, I mean, I don't know, Amanda, if you can add to that at all, like specific catering, but yeah.
I think that there's sort of like two ways that we think about it. One is the journalism, which we take wherever it needs to go to cover the story, right? And that is, if it's a multi-generational, way of looking at things, like that's what we're going to do. From a business perspective and an audience development perspective, I think we did make a conscious choice to not try to replicate other news organizations that are already focusing on much younger readers, whether it's millennials or zillennials or the skim or whatever, that we wanted to kind of start at a just to differentiate ourselves from those news products. So yeah, I mean, I think that's where we started. And I think we'll continue to let the journalism go where it needs to go to cover these issues with as much, nuance and, thoroughness as we need to. And from a audience building standpoint, I think we're going to continue to focus on not trying to replicate what is already out there and working well, but also just be open to that sort of multi-generational aspect to our life experiences. Like, how are we talking with our parents about issues, or how are we avoiding politics with our parents? What are we thinking about as we're taking care of children, young children through this pandemic and homeschooling? So if that sounds like a complex answer, it probably is, because it is complex.
Great. Well, wow, we have more than 40 questions. I'm obviously not going to be able to get to all of them, but let me attempt to condense and synthesize here a little bit between Jamie Lee and also Catherine Chavez. They're asking about events in particular, and Jamie asks, what message in your ask do you think resonates with these big names to say yes? And to follow up on that, Catherine says, how do you balance being independent with some of these politicians and celebrities, but still engaging with both sides?
Sure. So, I mean, I think, how do you remain balanced is, we're journalists first and foremost, and our events are journalism. The quote unquote celebrities are generally performing. And so, we're frequently not engaging with them in particular political conversations. They're lending their talents to drawing in a really diverse and robust audience for us. The reason they say yes to participating, I think, whether they're in politics or whether they are a performer, is because the 19th is aiming to reach an audience that's never been reached before, and is aiming to truly build an audience that is reflective of the nation's diversity. And I think the fact that we say that from the get-go, that we lay out those things that we stand for front and center, again, whether it's gender equity or racial justice, that resonates with them, and they want to be a part of the gospel that we're preaching, of the incredible journalism that we're producing. So I think we don't have trouble with those conversations because our journalists are professional. They ask tough questions of elected officials on any side of the aisle and everywhere in between. And our aim is to hold leaders to account, and we do that every day.
Yeah, we cover everyone without fear or favor. That's what I like to say.
Great. Well, let me wrap up with one more question, which is very of interest to our audience of largely journalism students, and that's from Gwen Mayo. Says, have you started internship opportunities yet? And how can young journalists who want to get involved and learn at the 19th, start getting more involved with your newsroom?
I should have said that in our coming soon, stay tuned. We don't yet have a formal fellowship program yet, and mainly because we want to be able to launch it with all of the resources that we feel like are required to really invest in relationship building and cultivating talent. So but that said, it is a conversation that we are having, and I would expect to hear more, I would say by the end of the year, about how that is a big part of our year 3, growth, if not sooner.
The one question you didn't ask is, how can you support the 19th? I'm going to take the liberty of asking that question. Amanda, how can you support the 19th?
Would you please go to 19thnews.org/membership, or if you just go to our homepage, you can see it there on the right-hand side. Yeah, that is the best way to become a member. You can see there's different benefits depending on your giving level, but the best benefit, honestly, is just knowing that you are helping make, reimagining politics and policy journalism to be more representative, to help change the world with us. I mean, we would be just so grateful to have your support and your vote of confidence in doing this work. And you get to hear from Emily and I on occasion, and definitely from Serena Henderson, who is really great at making sure that all of our members have front row seats to what's happening in our newsroom with the member newsletter every month. So those are just a few of the reasons that we hope you'll take us up on that offer, and you can do all of that at 19thnews.org/membership.
It's no SMU socks, but it's a close second.
You can get a tote
bag.
Speaking of SMU socks, wonderful segue there, Amanda.
I did that, and I set you up.
Yeah, so that was Emily's segue. The sock winner for today's lecture is Natalie Freeberg. You are the grand prize sock winner. We will reach out with details to get you some of those Meadow socks. But let me wrap up today's lecture by thanking Emily and Amanda so much for visiting with us and sharing so candidly with us what it's been like to launch a startup during a pandemic that changes the culture of American journalism and really serves communities that had been neglected and marginalized for such a long time. Both of you are an inspiration as entrepreneurs. You're an inspiration as industry leaders, and you're an inspiration as journalists. And I just couldn't be more thankful that you took the time to visit with us tonight. So thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thanks.
Third time is the charm. We're so glad that this finally worked out, and we're so grateful to all of you who showed up to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for the great questions, and thanks for having us.
And become our future fellows once we have that program.
Yeah, and if you want to keep an eye on, one last plug, on the jobs that we have open, 19thnews.org/jobs.
All right, well, sounds good. Well, thanks again for being so generous with your time. Thanks to all of you who came. We were up to almost 200 attendees with lots of good questions. I couldn't get to all of them, but again, thank you so much. And we will follow up with attendees with a link to the recording and other links to material that Emily and Amanda mentioned today. So that's going to be a wrap for O'Neill Lecture 2021. So thanks so much to everybody.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
you.